We are celebrating life today, and specifically, we are going to celebrate the sons in our lives. In John's Gospel, chapter 1, verses 9 through 13, we are told the true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world. The Bible is referring to Jesus here. And the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. We are allowed to be born as the children of God. Yes, biologically, at the moment of birth, every 4 seconds, on statistical average, a child is being born into the world. But spiritually, every time that someone comes to the point in their life that they accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, they are born, and the Bible says they become children of God. Last week, we celebrated the mothers that we have in our lives. Today, we're celebrating sons. Next week, we're going to celebrate daughters. Now, birth and conception is an amazing thing. Biologically, at the moment of conception, humans are created either male or female. This is truth. This is fact. This is not antiquated. This is not outdated. This is not narrow-minded thinking. The Bible declares many truths in Genesis chapter 1, including the fact that God created life. And as we read Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, we see that God created male and female, and that is truth. A woman always provides something called the X chromosome. And the male provides either an X chromosome or sometimes a Y chromosome. And depending on that combination, at the very moment of conception, the woman X chromosome joined with the male X chromosome, then another woman is created. A female child is begun at the very moment of conception, and that will not change throughout the entire life of that new little child. X plus X always means biologically this is a woman, this is a female. On the other hand, if the X chromosome combines with a Y chromosome, then a male or a boy, a man at the moment of conception is created. Sadly, these truths somehow are labeled sometimes as, well, that's a radical belief. No, it's biological truth. And unfortunately, the philosophy of today becomes the common sense of tomorrow. Maybe 60 or 70 years ago, there began to be a teaching that, boys needed to be raised to become more like women. No, that's not truth. But strangely, in the past 10 to 15 years, not only has that been propagated, there's a new teaching that, gender identity, that's just a very fluid notion. We shouldn't be talking in these radical kinds of old-fashioned thinking. Strangely, declaring truth, born out by the Bible and biology, is deemed old-fashioned. It's sometimes referred to despairingly as, well, that's just a conservative viewpoint. We unashamedly affirm the existence of male and female. And today we are celebrating the sons in our lives. And yes, from the moment of conception, there becomes a correlation between nature and nurture. How that child develops, that is greatly influenced by their environment and the way they are nurtured. In Luke's gospel, In chapter 1 and chapter 2, we see a beautiful picture of Mary and Joseph, and then Jesus. And in Luke chapter 2, verse 52, in one simple verse, we have a great combination that tells us that Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature, in favor with God and man. We see in these first chapters of Luke that Jesus had believing parents who practiced their faith, who were individuals of character. And we see that Jesus grew in all four areas of life. He grew in wisdom. We would say he grew intellectually. He grew in stature. He grew physically. He grew in favor with God. We could say he grew spiritually. He grew in favor with man. He grew socially. In all of these areas of our lives, all of us need to continue to grow. And we see in the life of Jesus the demonstration of a beautiful correlation between nature and nurture. Children observe two things very clearly in the lives of their parents and other adults. Children observe the love of parents and other adults, and they also observe the hypocrisy of their parents and other adults around them. Franklin Graham, the son of Billy Graham, went through a season of his life that he was very rebellious. And people have asked Franklin in an interview, Franklin, your father, Billy Graham, is perhaps one of the most well-known evangelists in the whole world in modern history. Did he ever come to you, or your mother come to you at some point and say, Franklin, you're really embarrassing us. You're making us look bad. Our reputation is at stake here. And Franklin said, no, my parents never did that. If they had ever done that, then I would have known that this whole thing about Christianity, that it was about their reputation. It wasn't about true belief. No, my parents never did that. Instead, what my parents did is they sat down and they talked with me and they said, son, we love you. And you know, son, that you are going against the values and the beliefs that we hold. Son, we cannot support those things that you're currently doing. But son, we love you, and the door is always open. You can always come home. And Franklin says, I could not argue against that. Not hypocrisy, but instead standards of right and wrong, values, commitments. Ultimately, though, there was always love. Children see both the love and the hypocrisy of their parents. And as we are raising boys and girls, there is a combination that we want to continue in positive ways. There are times that we need to talk to children heart to heart. And using big categories of life, perhaps women are better at dealing with emotions. Now, as soon as I say that, men have emotions. Men are not robots. But perhaps in the nature and nurture, perhaps women more often demonstrate heart-to-heart conversations, whereas boys and men, perhaps they could be referred to more as shoulder-to-shoulder. They want to see the actions. They want to put the rules into place. They want to have the talk and the feelings, but yes, they want to take that energy that they have as males, and perhaps sometimes they need to be treated more in a shoulder-to-shoulder relationship. In Ephesians chapter 5, verse 33, we will talk more about this in coming weeks, but there is a combination again, a balance, if you please, between love and respect. In Ephesians chapter 5, verse 33, the Bible says, however, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. People, boys and girls, need both. They need love, but they also need respect. And even at young ages, boys need to be treated with respect. If a boy is constantly pointed to as the bad example in his family, the bad example in his classroom, if he's constantly pointed out the negative things that is going to affect him, because that boy who's going to grow up to be a man, he needs to be respected. Yes, women need that also. But today, as we're thinking about boys, we need to think how we are nurturing them with both love and respect. Boys need to learn what it means to be a protector, to be a provider. They need role models. They need boundaries. Someone once said that if there are only rules, but there is no relationship, then that's going to lead to rebellion. And as we are raising children, there are some children that are, quote, low maintenance. They seem to always obey. They always comply. We never have any problems with this child. There are other children who are medium maintenance. Occasionally they go off track, but with just a little bit of correction, they come back. There are other children that are considered high maintenance. It's going to require much more time. The boundaries are going to have to be much more fixed in place, more strictly regulated. But you know, children tend to absorb the things that their parents love. My father loved to go fishing. And it is no surprise that he passed along that love of fishing. My younger brother loves to go fishing also. And in our family, one of our great family photos is me as an adult standing with my son, my brother as an adult standing with his son, and all four of us in the family were holding fish that we've caught. And it's a great little snapshot into our family life. This is something that our father loved, and he passed along that love. And even though he's not there in the picture, you can see generationally that extending. If a father loves sports, it doesn't mean that all of his children will love sports, but it tends to happen. If a father loves music, it doesn't mean that all of his children will love music, but it tends to happen. If a father loves God, and it's not just a series of going through the motions of, well, we went to church today, well, we paid a little bit of, no, if there is a sincere love of God within the heart of a father, then that gets modeled and that gets nurtured and that gets passed along. Now that child will still have to come to a point of decision. And unfortunately, there are some wonderful godly parents who go through the heartache of a child turning away from the Lord. But if we want to celebrate sons and if we want to see how sons develop, then it begins with us as adults considering the fact, what do we love? Every man needs to be a lover. Now, listen to me for the rest of the explanation. In Matthew chapter 23, verses 36 through 40, someone came to Jesus, and in Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 through 40, someone said, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like this. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets." Every man needs to be taught how to love the Lord and how to love others. Every man needs to be a learner. The Bible is full of knowledge that needs to be applied, and every man needs to become a leader. These are things that every boy needs to learn. If we went to the book of Proverbs, just as an example, if we went chapter by chapter through the book of Proverbs, we could see practical teaching that when applied, teaches boys, they need to learn to fear God. They need to learn to have humility. They need to learn to worship God. All people are tempted in the same way that is described in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. God declares his truth, and then Satan comes along and says, Is that really true? Maybe you could do things a different way. Now, you don't have to like tools. I happen to like tools, and you can tell that perhaps today. And this is a saw, and this particular saw is something that would be used on softer materials. It's called a handheld tool. And this has a very pointed end, for instance, that would help in using this tool. Or also today, you see this is, again, a different kind of a handsaw. And on this handsaw, I've got a safety blade. And this handsaw is a bit bigger and would be held and would cut different kinds of wood. And then as we move up, this is also a handheld tool, but it's a power saw. And you can see that there's a safety guard, a safety mechanism, so that is removed as the saw is used in hand. You could take the same principle and you could mount this more like this on something that's called a table. And then instead of moving the saw, you would actually move the wood. And as you do that, there is something called an invisible safety box. It's a reality, but you don't necessarily see it. But as you are moving that wood into this action zone, you need to remember that there is something called a safety box. And as that wood goes into that safety box, that wood will become cut. Also, if your hand goes into that safety box, if it can cut wood, if it can cut metal, if it can cut stone, yes, it will also cut. And there are many people in the world today working with powerful tools, and they avoid, or they somehow drift into this imaginary safety zone, and they pay a penalty for it. The Bible gives us instructions. They are not there to limit us, just the contrary. They are there to help us. And as we explain to boys how they should fear God, that's the first step in courage, is fearing the right things in life, and fearing God, having humility, having worship. If we read chapter by chapter through Proverbs, we could see instructions for boys about how to spend their time, about how to fulfill commitments, about how to have discipline in all areas of their lives. And yes, we would see very specific commandments about sexuality. In a different passage, if we went from Proverbs to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and if we look in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 12 through 20, again, we would see very clear teachings about sexual immorality and how that needs to be avoided. Sex is created and is to be enjoyed between a husband and a wife in the bond of marriage, period. All other forms of sexuality are sin. Between a woman, a man, in the bond of marriage. That is incredibly clear. It's also clear in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 12 through 20, that we need to flee from sexual morality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. So as we're teaching boys to become men, we need to be teaching them about the biblical standards, which are the true standards of sexuality. They also need to know about money. They need to know about overcoming addictions. In the book of Proverbs in that day, a lot is spoken about wine. Now, in our modern times, we might talk about addictions to gambling. We might talk about addictions to illicit drugs. All of us are going to be tempted in different areas of life. But just as that power tool can be used so creatively, but needs to be maintained within proper safety standards, our lives need to have proper boundaries, proper safety standards. And the Bible provides us for that. And we need to be encouraging our boys to be boys, to grow up into men, and to develop in all of these areas of their lives. Now, of course, each person is different. There's a really nice article that you could find. It's the title of the article is "The 3 Types of Men," junior size. So before they become men, they start out as boys. And the authors in this particular paper, they describe that some little boys are Mr. Command. From an early age, they take charge. They are leaders, and you don't want to throw away that natural ability that they have, but you also want them to learn to be temperate. That they might not be so good about thinking about other people's emotions. And so Mr. Command, he needs to learn, well, now, number one, God is in charge and you're not. And so you need to be thinking about other people. Or there could be someone called Mr. Visionary. Oh, he's creative. He's creative with ideas. He's creative with writing. He's creative with inventing. And those are great things that he has that, again, need to be nurtured, but they need to be channeled. Or you could have Mr. Steady. Now, often Mr. Steady, he's the favorite child of the family because he's just low maintenance. He just always obeys. He's just always there. He's never going to... But he has something that he needs to improve in also, because, Mr. Steady, he stays in his comfort zone. And once he's in that little comfort zone, he never ventures out. And there's times that a loving, nurturing relationship, he needs to be pushed out of that comfort zone. The authors say this: give all boys opportunities to make decisions that will affect others. Questions like, what shall we have for lunch? What Bible story will we read before bed? What chore should we do this afternoon that will help Daddy? This will help each boy in a different way. Command man will learn to consider what is best for the whole group. Visionary will learn to consider those he is leading before he makes a snap decision. And steady man, he will learn to make a decision, period. He needs to learn how to make decisions. Remember that you are raising the next generation of leaders, and leaders of all types must be trained to lead well. Today we're celebrating boys, the sons in our lives. There need to be good role models for boys. And tragically, there are many boys that are growing up without a father, perhaps because of death, perhaps because of a divorce, perhaps because the father simply abandoned them. And yes, mothers can do great, wonderful things, but we are created. And if a boy doesn't have a father in his own home, then we need to help that boy to find role models, positive examples of growing up. Yes, he can learn everything that he can learn from his mother, but he also needs to learn certain things that other men can teach him about being a godly, faithful man who loves the Lord, but loves others also. We need to demonstrate a love for God ourselves. As we celebrate sons, yes, the phrase, much more is caught than is taught. They are observing us, all of us. And they can see those who have a true relationship with God, who truly love God, and they can also see those that are hypocritical, that are just going through the motions. We need to explain the teachings of the Bible. If you have a son, consider doing this for the next month at his age-appropriate level, because different ages can discuss things at different levels. But what is appropriate for him? For this next month, take the Book of Proverbs and every day read one chapter of Proverbs and then discuss that and explain that with your son. And you will see a holistic nature of life touching multiple areas. And we need to celebrate the fact that we have boys in our lives. There's nothing wrong with being a little boy. A little boy doesn't need to be taught to become more like a woman. No, a little boy needs to be celebrated. He needs to be taught to grow up to be the best godly man that he can become. That's what we need to do as we celebrate the sons in our lives. Our brother Francois has sons, and today he's going to be offering on all of our behalf a prayer for the sons that we have in our lives. Let's bow as Francois leads us in that prayer.